This story begins with war. Not one war, but all of them. Every military conflict the United States has been involved in, from the earliest colonial entanglements to the complex global missions of today. Each war, large or small, official or covert, leaves a mark on maps, on minds, and often on the stories a country tells itself about who it is. Before there was a United States, there were colonies. These were British outposts, lining the eastern coast of North America, and their early wars weren't national struggles, but extensions of European rivalries. The most formative of these was the French and Indian War, which erupted in 1754. This war, often misunderstood by its name, was not between the French and indigenous peoples. Rather, it was a battle for territory and influence, with British colonists and their native allies on one side, and French colonists and their native allies on the other. What made this conflict remarkable was its reach. It wasn't just a colonial skirmish, it was the American theater of a much larger conflict raging across Europe, Asia, and beyond, known as the 7 Years' War. The British sought to expel the French from the interior of North America. French settlements, fur trade routes, and military forts dotted a vast area stretching from Canada through the Ohio River Valley. Control of this space was the prize, and it was soaked in blood before anyone claimed it. In the dense woods of Pennsylvania, a young Virginian named George Washington led a failed expedition against a French scouting party. That misfire quickly escalated. By 1756, Britain had formally declared war on France. The conflict sprawled across North America, involving sieges of remote forts, naval battles on the Great Lakes, and alliances with tribal nations who fought not for empire, but for survival. British troops, shipped in from overseas, joined colonial militias to fight the French. The war was brutal in its conditions. Soldiers waded through mud, mosquitoes, and long winters. Muskets misfired, roads barely existed, and officers sometimes disagreed more fiercely with each other than with the enemy. Colonial troops, often poorly supplied and lacking uniforms, developed a deep mistrust of British command, which viewed them as undisciplined and expendable. Eventually, the British emerged victorious. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, handed over control of most French territory in North America to Britain. France retained only a few Caribbean islands and trading posts. For the British colonists, this seemed like a new dawn. With the French threat gone, vast western lands opened up, at least in theory. But victory came with consequences. Britain's war debts were staggering. To recover costs, Parliament introduced new taxes on the colonies: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. What seemed like fiscal housekeeping in London felt like betrayal in Boston. Colonists who had fought and died for British victory were now being told to pay more while having less say in how they were governed. The British government also issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This land, promised in whispers and maps, was now off-limits to the very people who had fought for it. Many settlers ignored the order, drifting westward anyway, in quiet defiance. The seeds of rebellion had not been planted overnight, but this was fertile soil. On another front, Native American resistance didn't end with the war. In the same year the treaty was signed, a widespread indigenous uprising, later called Pontiac's War, broke out against British forts and settlers. It was not a coordinated national movement. No such structure existed, but a series of regional resistances sparked by encroachment, broken promises, and brutal reprisals. The British eventually quelled the fighting, but it came at a cost and reinforced the Crown's desire to keep colonial settlers boxed in along the coast. This period also revealed early contradictions in colonial identity. British Americans had fought under a foreign flag, shed blood for an empire, and celebrated a victory that brought new restrictions. They were part of Britain, but no longer felt entirely British. A distinct sense of being American began to emerge, shaped not by shared ideals, but by shared experience, in war, in resentment, and in ambition. Historians continue to debate whether this war was the true beginning of the American Revolution. Some argue that the colonial mistrust of Britain took root here, fertilized by disrespect and taxation. Others suggest the seeds had been planted long before, and this was merely the moment the light changed. One lesser-known detail from the conflict: Many colonial officers and soldiers operated with no standardized uniform, which led to confusion on the battlefield. Identification often came down to accent, behavior, or hastily tied pieces of cloth. Friendly fire was not uncommon, especially in dense forests or during surprise engagements. What emerged from the French and Indian War was a shaken, angrier, more confident colonial population. It had seen what organized military action could accomplish. It had felt the weight of imperial politics and taxation, and it had begun to imagine a future not tied to London's distant rule. The United States didn't exist yet, but its relationship with war had already begun. It would not be the last time this land fought over territory, taxation, or identity, nor would it be the last time soldiers returned home to find themselves on the edge of another kind of conflict, political, cultural, or economic. The next war would not be fought for the British Empire. It would be fought against it. The American colonies, freshly bruised from fighting Britain's war against France, were about to turn their attention inward. Within a dozen years of the Treaty of Paris, these colonies would no longer be outposts of an empire. They would be rebels. The Revolutionary War, starting in 1775, was not an inevitable rebellion, but a response to a long and winding build-up of tensions. Taxes were the spark, but not the cause. The real fracture grew from a sense of exclusion. Colonists had fought for Britain, died for Britain, and now found themselves treated like distant dependents. They had no representation in the British Parliament, yet Parliament dictated their taxes, commerce, and even their westward expansion. That phrase, often tossed around in classrooms, "no taxation without representation," wasn't just a slogan. It was the core of a larger grievance that the colonies had matured, but the empire still treated them like children. Protests turned into boycotts. Boycotts turned into riots. The Boston Massacre in 1770 left 5 colonists dead at the hands of British soldiers, a number both modest and monumental, depending on who told the story. Then came the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when protesters dressed as Mohawk warriors dumped an entire shipment of tea into the harbor. This theatrical act of defiance triggered a British overreaction. The coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Act, they were punitive, broad, and deeply unpopular. By 1775, gunfire erupted at Lexington and Concord. British troops, marching to seize weapons, clashed with colonial militias. No declaration had yet been made, but the war had begun. These early skirmishes revealed a crucial detail. The colonists could fight. They weren't professional soldiers, but they were familiar with the terrain, passionate about their cause, and increasingly united by a growing sense of shared identity. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence gave the war its official narrative. Written by Thomas Jefferson, edited by a committee, and adopted by the Continental Congress. The document wasn't just a list of grievances, it was a philosophical argument that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. If that consent is broken, rebellion is not only justified, it is required. The war that followed was uneven, brutal, and full of reversals. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, struggled with funding, training, and desertions. Militias came and went. The British Army, professional and well-equipped, assumed a quick victory. But geography favored the Americans. So did time. So did the growing international embarrassment. Britain suffered with every colonial success. France joined the war in 1778, not out of sympathy, but out of rivalry. Helping to humiliate Britain was reward enough. French ships, troops, and money tilted the scales. Spain and the Dutch Republic also lent aid, turning what began as a colonial rebellion into an international war. Battles ranged from the snowy north to the swamps of the south. Cities changed hands. Forts were lost and retaken. Loyalists, colonists, who sided with the British, fought alongside redcoats. Native tribes, too, were drawn into the conflict. Most sided with the British, believing they were the lesser threat to their lands. In many ways, this was a civil war, one with global consequences. One often overlooked detail: disease killed more soldiers than musket fire. Smallpox, dysentery, and fever swept through camps on both sides. Inoculation against smallpox, an experimental and controversial practice at the time, was promoted by Washington. who feared the disease more than the British Army. By 1781, the war climaxed at Yorktown, Virginia. A combined American and French force cornered British General Cornwallis, cutting off escape by land and sea. His surrender effectively ended the fighting, though the Treaty of Paris wouldn't be signed until 1783. The United States emerged battered, but independent. The cost had been high. Around 25,000 American dead, countless wounded, and a shattered economy. Britain had lost one of its most valuable colonies. France had won a diplomatic victory, though it came at enormous financial cost, a debt that would help spark its own revolution in 1789. Historians still debate how close the war came to failing. At several points, Washington nearly lost the army through mutiny or supply collapse. British leadership underestimated colonial resilience. Some argue that, if the British had offered political compromise earlier, independence might have been delayed or avoided entirely. Others maintain that the revolution was the natural outcome of a maturing colonial society demanding self-determination. After the war, loyalists who had supported the British fled to Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean. Native American tribes who had fought for the British found themselves isolated and vulnerable, with American settlers pushing westward into their lands with renewed speed. Despite victory, the new country was deeply uncertain. There was no standing army, no central bank, and barely a functioning government. But there was precedent. A people had taken up arms against one of the world's most powerful empires, and won. The Revolutionary War marked the United States' first true entry into the world of warfare, on its own terms. It wouldn't be the last. The new republic was born in violence, and its early identity would be shaped by the memory of rebellion, the struggle for control, and the belief, however romantic or dangerous, that liberty was something worth fighting for. Following independence, the United States entered a period of cautious nation-building. The Constitution was ratified, a federal government was established, and debates raged about how much power it should actually have. Most leaders wanted to avoid entanglements abroad, but avoiding war proved harder than expected. In 1812, war returned. The United States declared war on Britain, once again, this time as a sovereign country, not a rebel colony. Known simply as the War of 1812, it's often remembered as a confusing conflict with unclear results, yet it had very specific causes. The British Royal Navy had been seizing American merchant ships and forcing their crews into service, a practice known as impressment. Britain, locked in a massive war with Napoleon's France, justified it as a necessary means of reinforcing their fleet. For American sailors, it was legalized kidnapping. The US government saw it as a violation of national sovereignty. There were also economic tensions. Britain had placed trade restrictions that hurt American merchants. On top of that, frontier settlers accused Britain of arming native tribes to resist US expansion in the Northwest Territory. Whether this was entirely true or not, it heightened distrust. When war was declared in June 1812, the country was far from united. New England states, heavily reliant on trade with Britain, opposed the war. Southern and western states, more focused on expansion and national pride, supported it. The military was poorly prepared. The standing army was small, scattered, and underfunded. The Navy had only a few operational ships compared to Britain's vast fleet. The early battles went poorly. An American attempt to invade Canada, then a British colony, ended in disaster. Detroit was surrendered without a fight. Niagara campaigns failed. American forces were often outmatched, and leadership was inconsistent. But the war wasn't entirely one-sided. At sea, the young US Navy scored surprising victories. The USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, defeated British warships in dramatic duels, boosting morale. On the Great Lakes, American forces under Oliver Hazard Perry secured a crucial victory in the Battle of Lake Erie. His dispatch, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," became a moment of national pride. On the western frontier, Native American resistance continued. Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader who had long sought to unite tribes against US expansion, allied with the British. His death in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames marked a turning point. Without him, the pan-tribal resistance collapsed, and American settlers pushed deeper into native territory. By 1814, the tide had shifted. In Europe, Napoleon was defeated, freeing Britain to focus entirely on the war in America. British forces launched a series of powerful offensives. In August, they captured Washington, D.C., and burned public buildings, including the White House and the Capitol. It was a symbolic humiliation. But at Baltimore, American defenses held. The British bombardment of Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key to write a poem that would later become the national anthem. Ironically, the words "The Star-Spangled Banner" describe a moment when the flag, barely hanging on, had just survived a brutal attack. Not a triumph, but a narrow escape. The most famous battle of the war came after it had officially ended. On January 8, 1815, General Andrew Jackson led American forces in a stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans. British troops marched in tight formations across open ground, straight into prepared artillery and rifle fire. It was a one-sided slaughter. What the public didn't yet know was that the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed weeks earlier. News traveled slowly in the early 19th century. The war's outcome was, on paper, a draw. No territory changed hands. The treaty restored pre-war boundaries and said nothing about impressment or trade restrictions. But politically, the US framed it as a second war of independence, a moment when the nation stood up to a global power and didn't collapse. Historians still argue about who actually won. Britain had little to gain and nothing to prove, and was mostly eager to move on. The United States failed to conquer Canada, but defended its territory. One legacy was the rise of American nationalism. Another was the destruction of the Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and looked unpatriotic after the New Orleans victory. A lesser-known but important detail, the war contributed to the end of native autonomy in the eastern United States. As British support faded, so too did any serious resistance to American expansion into the Ohio Valley and beyond. The War of 1812 also marked the last major US conflict with Britain. Relations would remain complex, but never again lead to open war. It also encouraged American leaders to reconsider military readiness. The post-war years saw increased investment in coastal defenses, a modest standing army, and the beginnings of a professional military tradition. While largely overshadowed by the Revolution and the Civil War, the War of 1812 was pivotal. It tested the young republic's will, clarified its sense of identity, and cleared away the last remnants of colonial dependence. The war's final image wasn't one of triumph, but of endurance, a battered flag still flying through smoke, ragged and defiant. After the War of 1812, the United States turned its gaze westward, with European powers distracted or weakened, and native resistance in retreat. The idea of expansion became more than a hope, it became national policy. What followed was a surge of movement, myth-making, and inevitably war. In 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. This conflict, commonly called the Mexican-American War, was rooted in expansionist ambition. The United States had already annexed Texas the year before, a move that Mexico considered both illegal and provocative. The annexation reignited a long-standing border dispute. Mexico claimed the border was at the Nueces River. The US insisted it was the Rio Grande. The territory in between was more than just scrubland. It was a symbol of sovereignty, and neither side was interested in compromise. President James K. Polk, a firm believer in manifest destiny, the notion that the United States was destined to spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, used a skirmish along the Rio Grande as justification for war. American troops had entered the disputed zone, and Mexican forces attacked. Polk declared that American blood had been shed on American soil. Congress approved the war, though not without protest. Among the critics was a young Illinois congressman named Abraham Lincoln, who questioned whether the conflict had truly been provoked. The war unfolded on multiple fronts. US forces invaded northern Mexico from Texas, while others landed by sea near the port of Veracruz, and marched inland toward Mexico City. It was the first American war to be fought largely on foreign soil. The fighting was intense, especially for a military that was still developing its professional identity. The US Army included figures who would later shape history on both sides of the Civil War: Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and others. Mexican forces, under the command of General Antonio López de Santa Anna, resisted fiercely, but were hampered by internal political divisions and supply problems. The Americans captured key cities, and in 1847, after a brutal urban campaign, they occupied Mexico City. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. The treaty was expansive. Mexico ceded roughly half its territory to the United States, including what would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other states. In exchange, the US paid $15 million and assumed some debts owed by Mexico to American citizens. The consequences were enormous. The United States had achieved its continental ambition, but not without cost. The war left thousands dead, deepened sectional tensions at home, and introduced new questions about slavery. Would these vast new territories permit it? The debate sharpened the divide between North and South. One often overlooked element of the war was the role of military photography and battlefield reporting. Though limited in scope, this was one of the first conflicts where the broader American public received fairly regular updates, stoking both patriotism and dissent. There was also a growing anti-war movement. Writers and intellectuals, most famously Henry David Thoreau, condemned the war as an unjust conquest. Thoreau refused to pay taxes in protest and wrote his essay Civil Disobedience as a result, which would later influence figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Historians still debate whether the war was driven purely by manifest destiny, or if it was more a calculated effort to expand slavery under the guise of national growth. Some see Polk's actions as deliberate provocation designed to force Mexico into war. Others argue the conflict was inevitable, given the border confusion and the rapid population surge into Texas. In Mexico, the war is remembered as a national trauma. It reshaped the country's borders, economy, and political identity. In the United States, it was a short, successful war with long, complicated consequences. The land gained was rich, vast, and strategic, but it came with the cost of instability, both in diplomatic reputation and in domestic cohesion. Another quirky detail: during the occupation of Mexico City, US troops were accompanied by a volunteer unit known as the St. Patrick's Battalion, mostly Irish immigrants who had defected from the US Army to fight for Mexico, citing discrimination and shared Catholic faith. Many were captured and executed after the war, and they remain heroes in Mexican memory. By the end of the 1840s, the map had changed dramatically. The Pacific was now an American coast. Gold would soon be discovered in California. Railroads, towns, and industries would follow. But the issues left behind by the war, the balance of power between free and slave states, the treatment of Mexican citizens in the newly acquired territories, and the moral limits of expansion, would fester. The Mexican-American War marked a moment when ambition became conquest. It was efficient, bold, and undeniably successful in strategic terms. But it also showed that wars, even short ones, never end with the signing of a treaty. Their shadows stretch on across borders, laws, and memories. By the 1850s, the United States stretched from ocean to ocean, but the sense of unity that had defined its early years was beginning to crumble. The victories of the Mexican-American War had added enormous swaths of territory to the country, but they also reignited a question that had never been truly settled. Would slavery expand into these new lands, or would it be stopped? The answer to that question would come in fire. The American Civil War began in 1861, though the tensions that led to it had been brewing for decades. At the heart of the divide was slavery, a deeply entrenched institution in the southern states, and increasingly condemned in the north. But the conflict wasn't just moral, it was also economic and political. The South depended on enslaved labor for its cotton economy and feared that limits on slavery would mean limits on its way of life. The North, growing more industrial and populous, viewed the South's demands as a threat to democracy and national unity. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final blow, although Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. Southern leaders believed his presidency marked the beginning of the end for their institution. 11 Southern states eventually seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The federal government considered this illegal, and war began when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April 1861. The war that followed was the deadliest in American history. Over 600,000 soldiers died. with millions more wounded or displaced. Battles raged across thousands of miles from Pennsylvania cornfields to Mississippi swamps. The technology of war had advanced, but tactics often had not. Muskets were replaced by rifled guns, and cannons grew more powerful, yet generals still ordered frontal charges that led to catastrophic losses. One major front was in the east, where Union and Confederate armies clashed repeatedly in Virginia. Another was in the west, where control of rivers and railroads became crucial. Naval blockades strangled southern ports. Cities like Vicksburg and Atlanta became symbols of grinding, total warfare. In the early years, the Confederacy had the advantage of fighting defensively on familiar ground. Their generals, especially Robert E. Lee, gained reputations for bold tactics. The Union, however, had more resources, more men, more industry, and more money. Over time, those advantages began to shift the tide. A turning point came in 1863 with the Battle of Gettysburg. In a three-day clash that left over 50,000 casualties, the Union repelled Lee's invasion of the North. That same year, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate territory were free. The proclamation didn't end slavery everywhere, but it redefined the war's purpose. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now explicitly about ending slavery. The war's brutality extended beyond the battlefield. Entire towns were destroyed. Civilians suffered through food shortages, disease, and occupation. In the South, enslaved people fled plantations, sabotaged Confederate infrastructure, and joined the Union Army in growing numbers. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black men had served in the Union forces. Historians continue to debate whether the South ever had a real chance to win. Some argue that if Britain or France had intervened, or if the North had lost patience, the Confederacy might have secured independence. Others point to the overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority of the Union as making Southern defeat inevitable. A lesser known but striking element of the war was its documentation. For the first time, war photography brought images of battlefields, dead soldiers, and ruined towns into public view. Matthew Brady and others captured scenes that shocked civilians and changed how war was understood at home. The Civil War became not just a fight, it became a national trauma shared in stark detail. By 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Union General Ulysses S. Grant pursued Lee through Virginia. General William Tecumseh Sherman conducted a devastating march through Georgia and the Carolinas, destroying infrastructure and weakening Southern morale. In April, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Other Confederate armies soon followed. Lincoln didn't live to see the full outcome. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth just days after the surrender, plunging the country into mourning and leaving Reconstruction in the hands of less capable successors. The Civil War ended slavery, but it did not end the divisions it had exposed. The South was devastated, economically, socially, and politically. The North faced the immense task of reintegrating rebellious states and securing rights for newly freed people. Reconstruction would bring its own form of conflict, less visible, but still bitter and violent. The Civil War remains the defining conflict in American history. It tested the limits of democracy, shattered myths of unity, and forced a nation to reckon with its founding contradictions. It also introduced new ideas about citizenship, federal authority, and the meaning of freedom, ideas that would shape every future American war, directly or indirectly. One grim but fascinating detail: many amputees from the war would gather in veterans' reunions for decades, comparing prosthetics and scars. Some brought the very bullets or bone fragments extracted from their bodies. In a way, the war never left them. It would take generations for the United States to recover, and even then, the ghosts of the Civil War would linger, etched into monuments, names, flags, and politics. The war had preserved the Union, but it had not healed it. After the Civil War, the United States turned its attention inward. But war did not end. Throughout the late 19th century, the country was locked in nearly continuous conflict with the indigenous peoples of North America. These wars, often labeled collectively as the Indian Wars, were not a single campaign, but a rolling tide of violence tied to expansion, settlement, and broken promises. Following the war with Mexico and the acquisition of the Western Territories, settlers surged westward, railroads, gold rushes, and government land policies accelerated the pace. The ideology of manifest destiny, still very much alive, held that it was the nation's right, even duty, to expand across the continent. But this land was not empty. It was home to dozens of indigenous nations, each with its own society, governance, and spiritual relationship to the land. To the US government, indigenous nations were often seen as obstacles, or more diplomatically as wards to be relocated or assimilated. Treaties were made and often broken. When resistance came, it was met with military force. Entire tribes were forcibly moved onto reservations, often in unfamiliar, inhospitable terrain, under threat of starvation or death. The conflict spanned decades and terrains. On the plains, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fought to protect their hunting grounds. In the Southwest, the Apache resisted American and Mexican efforts to control their territories. In the Pacific Northwest and Great Basin, lesser-known wars flared as well, each with its own unique cause and context. One of the most famous episodes was the Great Sioux War of 1876-77. The US had promised the Black Hills of South Dakota to the Lakota under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. But when gold was discovered there, the treaty was disregarded. Miners poured in, and the army followed. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse rose to resist. In June 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors decisively defeated US forces, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. Custer and more than 200 of his men were killed in what the press dubbed Custer's last stand. The victory was stunning, but temporary. Public outrage back east fueled reinforcements. Within a year, most resistance had been crushed, and Crazy Horse surrendered. Sitting Bull fled to Canada for a time before eventually returning and being killed in a later conflict. In the Southwest, the Apache Wars stretched over decades. Leaders like Cochise and later Geronimo fought fiercely against both Mexican and American forces. Geronimo's eventual capture in 1886 marked the symbolic end of large-scale indigenous resistance in the continental US. By the 1890s, most native nations had been confined to reservations. Traditional lifeways were disrupted or destroyed. The buffalo herds that had sustained plains tribes had been hunted to near extinction, both by settlers and by official policy. The federal government launched efforts to forcibly assimilate indigenous people into American society. Children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools, where they were punished for speaking their languages or practicing their cultures. Historians still debate how to classify these conflicts. Were they wars of conquest, a form of internal colonialism, or simply the violent collision of two incompatible systems? What is increasingly accepted is that these were not isolated skirmishes, but an interconnected and often coordinated campaign to dismantle indigenous sovereignty. One lesser-known event was the Nez Perce War of 1877. The Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, tried to flee to Canada to avoid forced relocation. Pursued for over 1,000 miles by US forces, they fought a series of defensive battles before being trapped just short of the border. Chief Joseph's surrender speech, "I will fight no more forever," became one of the most quoted in American history, though it was largely ignored at the time. The final military engagement, often cited as the end of the Indian Wars, came in 1890 at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. US troops surrounded a Lakota encampment and attempted to disarm them. A shot was fired, no one knows from which side, and chaos erupted. Over 50 Lakota were killed, many of them women and children. The event, often described as a massacre, shocked even some military observers. It marked the end of organized indigenous resistance in the contiguous United States. There were quirks even in this grim era. For example, the US Army used camels in the Southwest during the 1850s as an experimental transportation unit, the Camel Corps. Though it never caught on, it remains a strange footnote in the history of frontier warfare. The Indian Wars reshaped the continent. They cleared the way for railroads, farms, and towns, but at the cost of hundreds of cultures, thousands of lives, and a spiritual severing of people from land. These wars were not simply background noise to American expansion. They were its foundation. The legacy remains visible today in land disputes, legal battles over treaty rights, and efforts to preserve indigenous languages and traditions. For generations, these conflicts were downplayed or sanitized in textbooks. More recent scholarship and activism have pushed to recognize them not as side stories, but as central chapters in the American story. In the end, the Indian Wars weren't a series of battles, they were a process, a long, slow, often unacknowledged war waged not just with rifles, but with laws, schools, railroads, and fences. And like many wars, this one didn't really end. It simply changed forms. As the 19th century neared its close, the United States began to look beyond its continental borders. Expansion, once westward across prairies and mountains, now pointed overseas. Trade, naval strategy, and a growing interest in global prestige all played their part. The next conflict, the Spanish-American War of 1898, was brief, dramatic, and marked a turning point. It signaled the arrival of the United States as an imperial power. The war had its origins in Cuba, where a long-standing rebellion against Spanish rule had flared once again in the 1890s. The Cuban struggle for independence drew American sympathy, both for its revolutionary echoes and for economic interests in sugar plantations. Newspapers, especially those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, fanned the flames of public support for intervention. Their sensationalist coverage, often exaggerated or outright invented, became known as yellow journalism. In 1898, an American battleship, the USS Maine, exploded in Havana Harbor. The cause was never definitively proven, but American media blamed Spanish sabotage. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became the war cry. Under pressure from both Congress and the public, President William McKinley asked for authority to use force. War was declared in April. The conflict unfolded in two main theaters, the Caribbean and the Pacific. In Cuba, American forces landed at places like Ducray-en-Siboney, pushing inland against Spanish troops. The most famous engagement was the Battle of San Juan Hill, where future President Theodore Roosevelt led the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry regiment composed of cowboys, Ivy League athletes, and others seeking adventure. Though often credited with a heroic charge, Roosevelt's role was smaller than later legend would suggest. The actual heavy lifting came from black regiments of the regular army, whose contributions were largely overlooked at the time. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the U.S. Navy struck quickly. Commodore George Dewey led a fleet into Manila Bay in the Philippines, destroying the Spanish Pacific Squadron in a single morning. It was a decisive and nearly bloodless victory, for the Americans at least. What followed was a more complex story. Spain, already weakened and politically divided, surrendered within months. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, ceded control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. While Cuba was promised independence, though under heavy U.S. influence, the other territories were outright annexed. The U.S. had officially become a colonial power. This shift sparked debate at home. Some celebrated the victory as the dawn of a new era, America, strong and global. Others warned that imperialism betrayed the country's founding ideals. Figures like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie joined the Anti-Imperialist League, arguing that ruling over others without their consent was both immoral and un-American. Historians continue to debate the sincerity of America's motives. Was the war truly about liberating Cuba, or was it a convenient justification for expansion? The evidence points in both directions. Economic interests, geopolitical strategy, and genuine public outrage all played a role. A curious footnote: Theodore Roosevelt, whose reputation soared after the war, had resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to fight. But before leaving, he gave a fateful order, without the president's knowledge, to send Dewey's fleet to the Philippines. That decision opened a new front in what had started as a Caribbean war. The war lasted only 4 months, but carried enormous consequences. The US had gained new territories, but also new responsibilities and new resistance. In the Philippines, independence fighters who had been battling Spain assumed the Americans would support their cause. When that didn't happen, the next conflict began, one even bloodier and far more controversial. But the Spanish-American War also changed how the US saw itself. The country had tested its military abroad, achieved rapid victory, and staked a claim in international politics. It now possessed overseas bases, new trade routes, and a more visible role on the world stage. It also marked the rise of the modern American military. Lessons from the war about logistics, training, and disease prevention spurred reforms. More officers attended professional military schools. Equipment was standardized. The war had been a public spectacle, but it also exposed weaknesses that would be addressed in the years to come. One lesser-known impact: the war introduced thousands of American troops to tropical disease. In fact, more US soldiers died from illness, especially yellow fever and malaria, than from combat. This led to major public health campaigns, including future work by Dr. Walter Reed, who would help identify the mosquito as the carrier of yellow fever. By the turn of the century, the US had stepped into the imperial ring, joining powers like Britain, France, and Japan in the race for global influence. The Spanish-American War may have been short, but it signaled the end of American isolation and the beginning of a far more complicated role in global affairs. When the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, many assumed the Philippines, like Cuba, would soon gain its independence. Filipino nationalists, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had been fighting for liberation from Spain and had welcomed American forces as allies. But the US government had different plans. Instead of granting the Philippines independence, the United States took possession of the islands under the Treaty of Paris. Aguinaldo, feeling betrayed, declared a new Philippine Republic. The result was the Philippine-American War, a conflict far longer and more brutal than the one that had preceded it. The war began in February 1899, with a firefight between Filipino and American troops near Manila. It escalated quickly. American forces sought to crush the new republic, while Filipino guerrillas fought a war of attrition in jungles, mountains, and towns. What started as a conventional war soon turned into a prolonged insurgency, one marked by ambushes, reprisals, and widespread suffering among civilians. The US military response was fierce. Villages suspected of harboring insurgents were burned. Civilians were relocated to controlled zones to isolate guerrillas, a tactic similar to those used by colonial powers elsewhere. American commanders, frustrated by elusive enemies, sometimes resorted to collective punishment. Torture, including the notorious water cure, was reported and later investigated in the US Senate. Estimates of the death toll vary widely. Around 4,000 American soldiers died, but Filipino casualties were far higher. Combat deaths are believed to be between 20,000 and 30,000, but civilian deaths, mostly from disease and displacement, may have reached several hundred thousand. The war formally ended in 1902, with the capture of key Filipino leaders and the official declaration that resistance had been defeated. In reality, guerrilla activity continued for years in some regions. Full control was never absolute, and unrest flared intermittently for decades. Back in the United States, public opinion was divided. Some celebrated the annexation as a step toward American greatness. Others, including anti-imperialist voices like Mark Twain and former President Grover Cleveland, condemned the conflict as a betrayal of American values. The Anti-Imperialist League published essays, gave speeches, and lobbied against colonial rule, but the tide of expansion proved difficult to reverse. Historians still debate whether the conflict was a war of empire, a tragic misunderstanding, or both. Some argue the US had no clear long-term plan and stumbled into an occupation it hadn't fully prepared for. Others see it as a deliberate exercise in imperial control, justified by the racial and cultural prejudices of the time. One striking detail is how the war influenced American military doctrine. Fighting guerrillas in unfamiliar terrain forced officers to rethink conventional tactics. Some of those lessons about counterinsurgency, population control, and intelligence would reappear in later conflicts, particularly in Vietnam. The war also shaped the political future of the Philippines. Though the US introduced public education, new infrastructure, and some limited self-government, these came alongside repression and economic control. It wasn't until 1946, after World War II, that the Philippines would finally gain full independence. A curious and often overlooked episode: African American soldiers, who served in segregated units, were among those deployed to the Philippines. Some expressed discomfort with the racial parallels between America's treatment of Filipinos and its treatment of black citizens at home. A few even defected to the Filipino side, citing solidarity against oppression. The Philippine-American War is rarely given the same attention as other US conflicts, but its legacy is significant. It marked the first time the United States fought a large-scale counterinsurgency campaign overseas. It exposed the contradictions in American foreign policy, preaching liberty while denying it abroad, and it signaled that the age of continental conquest was over. From here on, American wars would increasingly be fought across oceans. The occupation of the Philippines also gave the US a strategic foothold in Asia. Military bases established there would play critical roles in future conflicts, particularly during World War II. Trade routes, naval logistics, and diplomatic influence all expanded from this hub. The Philippines became in effect America's first major colony, a reality that many Americans never fully grappled with. By the early 20th century, the United States had grown more powerful, but also more entangled. It had gone to war in the name of liberation, and ended up administering a sprawling overseas territory. The ideals of the revolution were being tested, stretched, and in some cases contradicted. And although the war officially ended in 1902, its effects rippled onward. Generations of Filipinos would grow up under American rule, and generations of Americans would be taught a simplified version of the story if they heard it at all. It remains one of the least remembered, yet most revealing, conflicts in US history. By the time World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States had grown used to watching foreign conflicts from afar. The American public, still weary from the memory of the Philippine-American War and skeptical of European entanglements, generally supported a policy of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson echoed that sentiment, declaring the country neutral in thought as well as in action. But staying out of the Great War would prove impossible. The war in Europe began with a complex web of alliances, assassinations, and rising nationalism. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, which triggered a cascade of military obligations that pulled in Germany, Russia, France, and Britain. Trench warfare, poison gas, and machine guns turned the European landscape into a deadly stalemate. Though America was officially neutral, its economy was not. Trade with the Allied powers surged, and US banks lent vast sums to Britain and France. German submarines began targeting merchant ships supplying the Allies, raising tensions with Washington. The tipping point came in 1917. German U-boats resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship, civilian or military, traveling to Allied ports. Several American vessels were lost, and public outrage grew. Around the same time, British intelligence intercepted the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany offered Mexico an alliance in the event of war with the US, promising the return of lost territory in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The message was shared with the American press, and support for war spiked. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Wilson framed the conflict as a moral crusade. The world must be made safe for democracy. It was the first time the US had entered a European war, and the scale of mobilization was unprecedented. The American military was not fully prepared for modern war. The US Army was small by European standards, and new draftees had to be trained, equipped, and shipped across the Atlantic. But industrial capacity and manpower gave the Allies hope. By mid-1918, over 1 million American soldiers, known as doughboys, were in France. American forces joined British and French troops on the Western Front. Though arriving late in the war, their presence proved decisive. Battles like Cantigny, Belleau Wood, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive showcased American tenacity. At Belleau Wood, US Marines held off a major German advance in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The fight lasted nearly a month, and became a symbol of American resolve. World War I was unlike any previous conflict. The modern technologies, machine guns, tanks, chemical weapons, aircraft, created nightmarish conditions. Trenches stretched for miles, often filled with water, rats, and disease. Soldiers went over the top into open fields laced with barbed wire and machine gun fire. Death came quickly and impersonally. Despite these horrors, American involvement was relatively brief. After just over a year of combat, the Central Powers crumbled, Germany, facing internal revolt and Allied advances, agreed to an armistice on November 11. The war was over, leaving more than 16 million dead worldwide, including over 116,000 Americans. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war. It imposed harsh penalties on Germany, territorial losses, disarmament, and heavy reparations. Wilson brought his vision for a League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, to the peace talks. But back in the US, the Senate refused to ratify the treaty, fearing it would entangle America in future wars. The US never joined the League, and the dream of a lasting international peace faltered. Historians still debate whether American involvement in the war was driven more by economics, morality, or fear of German power. Some argue that US loans and trade tied the nation too tightly to Allied success. Others believe Wilson was genuinely motivated by a vision of democratic order. The truth may lie somewhere in between. A lesser-known detail: during the war, over 370,000 African Americans served in the military, mostly in segregated units. Many were assigned to labor roles, but some, like the Harlem Hellfighters, saw frontline combat and earned international acclaim. Despite their service, returning black soldiers faced renewed racism and violence at home, a grim reminder that democracy abroad did not yet mean equality at home. The war also changed the home front. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling roles left vacant by enlisted men. The suffrage movement gained momentum, and in 1920, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. The federal government also expanded dramatically, organizing the economy, managing propaganda, and shaping public opinion through the Committee on Public Information. One particularly strange moment: in 1918, during the height of the war, a worldwide influenza pandemic broke out. Known as the Spanish flu, it infected a third of the global population and killed more people than the war itself. An estimated 50 million. Troop movements and close-quarter living accelerated its spread. More American soldiers died from flu than from German bullets. Though the fighting ended in 1918, the war's legacy was long and jagged. It redrew borders, dismantled empires, and sowed the seeds for future conflict. For the United States, it marked the beginning of a more active, though hesitant, role on the world stage. The country had tipped into global affairs, but still wasn't entirely sure it wanted to stay. After World War I, the United States retreated from global military commitments but did not stop using force to protect its interests, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. The early 20th century saw a series of small, often overlooked military actions known collectively as the Banana Wars. These were not formal wars in the traditional sense, but rather a string of interventions, occupations, and skirmishes aimed at maintaining American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The nickname comes from the major American fruit companies, especially the United Fruit Company that operated in Central America and the Caribbean. These corporations wielded enormous influence and lobbied for US military support when their profits or property were threatened. The pattern was familiar: local instability would rise, and American Marines would land. One of the earliest examples was in Cuba, just years after it had gained independence. Though nominally sovereign, Cuba was heavily influenced by the US under the terms of the Platt Amendment, which allowed American intervention in Cuban affairs. US troops occupied Cuba multiple times in the early 1900s to suppress revolts and protect order. In the Dominican Republic, American forces landed in 1916 and stayed for 8 years, controlling the government, customs, and finances. The official justification was to prevent European creditors from using military force to collect debts, a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which opposed European intervention in the Americas. But critics saw it as a naked assertion of US power. Haiti experienced an even more intense occupation. After years of political turmoil, American Marines arrived in 1915 and remained until 1934. During that time, the US rewrote the Haitian Constitution, took control of finances, and imposed martial law. Though some infrastructure and public health systems improved, the occupation was deeply resented. Haitian resistance fighters, known as cacos, waged guerrilla warfare against the Marines, who responded with brutal counterinsurgency tactics. In Central America, Nicaragua became a near protectorate. Marines were sent repeatedly throughout the 1910s and 1920s to support governments favorable to US business interests. One of the most famous figures to emerge from this period was Augusto Cesar Sandino, a Nicaraguan nationalist who led a prolonged resistance against the US occupation. His campaign lasted years and became a symbol of anti-imperialist struggle across Latin America. Sandino was eventually assassinated in 1934, but his legacy endured. Decades later, the socialist Sandinista movement that took power in Nicaragua would claim his name. These early interventions left behind long shadows, militarized police forces, fragile institutions, and a deep well of resentment toward American interference. Another notable intervention took place in Honduras, where American troops landed repeatedly from 1903 to 1925. Though these occupations were usually short, they were frequent, earning the country the nickname Banana Republic, referring to the dominance of foreign fruit companies and the instability they fostered. Historians debate whether these actions were defensive or imperial. Supporters at the time argued that they prevented chaos, protected American lives, and promoted regional stability. Critics countered that they propped up dictators, suppressed popular movements, and treated Latin America as a backyard empire. One little-known aspect of these interventions is how they influenced military training and doctrine. The US Marine Corps developed detailed manuals on small wars during this period, outlining tactics for counterinsurgency, civil affairs, and occupation governance. These manuals would influence American military thinking for decades, especially during the Vietnam War. The Banana Wars also produced early experiments in military aviation. In Haiti and Nicaragua, Marines used planes for reconnaissance and even aerial bombing, primitive by today's standards, but innovative for the time. At home, these interventions rarely made headlines, unless American lives were lost. Most were justified under the vague banner of protecting democracy, but the reality on the ground was often more about maintaining access to resources and trade routes. American soldiers found themselves caught in complex local conflicts with little understanding of the language, culture, or history involved. Despite their low profile today, the Banana Wars were pivotal in shaping US foreign policy. They normalized the use of force to manage distant affairs and created a model of intervention that would be repeated, though often on a larger scale in the Cold War era. By the 1930s, public sentiment had begun to shift. The Great Depression refocused attention inward, and a growing sense of disillusionment with empire led to the so-called Good Neighbor policy under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This marked a rhetorical move away from military intervention and toward economic and diplomatic engagement, though the underlying power dynamics remained largely intact. One odd historical tidbit: Major Smedley Butler, a highly decorated Marine who served in many of these conflicts, later became one of their fiercest critics. In retirement, he gave public speeches condemning US foreign policy, famously declaring, "I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." His 1935 book, War is a Racket, became a foundational text for anti-interventionist thinkers. The Banana Wars didn't involve grand battles or declarations of war, but they were wars nonetheless, fought in jungles and city streets, with bullets, bribes, and bureaucrats. They left behind railroads, constitutions, and scars. And while they rarely appear in American classrooms, their consequences still echo in the politics and memory of Latin America. The Second World War was unlike any conflict the United States had faced before. It spanned continents, involved dozens of nations, and redefined the global order. When the war began in 1939, the US once again attempted neutrality, but as with the First World War, neutrality proved fragile in the face of expanding threats, economic ties, and ideological stakes. The war began with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, triggering declarations of war from Britain and France. Over the next 2 years, Adolf Hitler's forces overran much of Europe. Italy joined the Axis powers, and Japan, already deeply involved in China, expanded its aggression across East Asia and the Pacific. The United States, while officially neutral, provided material support to the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, which supplied weapons and goods to Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union. The turning point came on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. a major US naval base in Hawaii. The attack killed over 2,400 Americans and destroyed or damaged much of the Pacific Fleet. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy, as Japan's allies, declared war on the US shortly after. The United States was now fully engaged in a global war. World War II was fought on two main fronts, the European theater and the Pacific theater. In Europe, American forces joined British, Soviet, and other Allied troops to fight Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, the US faced a sprawling, brutal campaign against Japanese forces, spread across thousands of islands. The mobilization was vast. Over 16 million Americans served in uniform, and the economy shifted entirely to wartime production. Factories that once made cars now produced tanks, aircraft, and munitions. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. War bonds, rationing, and propaganda became part of daily life. On the European front, American troops first saw major combat in North Africa in 1942, fighting alongside the British against German and Italian forces. From there, they moved into Sicily and then Italy, encountering fierce resistance. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union absorbed massive German assaults on the Eastern Front, bearing the heaviest casualties of the war. The most iconic American campaign came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, France, in the largest amphibious invasion in history. The operation marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. US, British, and Canadian troops pushed inland, liberating France, and eventually moving into Germany itself. In April 1945, Hitler committed suicide as Soviet troops closed in on Berlin. Germany surrendered in May, but the war was not over. In the Pacific, the conflict had taken a different shape. The US strategy, known as island hopping, involved seizing strategic islands while bypassing others, gradually tightening the noose around Japan. Battles at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were grueling and costly, with high casualties on both sides, and a refusal by Japanese troops to surrender. To avoid what was expected to be a catastrophic invasion of mainland Japan, the United States turned to a new and terrible weapon. On August 6 and 9, 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was immediate and unprecedented. Over 100,000 people died, many of them civilians. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. World War II ended in 1945, but its effects were seismic. Over 400,000 Americans had died. The Holocaust had exposed the horrors of genocide. Entire cities lay in ruins across Europe and Asia. The war had not only redrawn borders, it had reshaped ideologies, economies, and global power structures. One detail often overlooked: World War II saw widespread use of code talkers, particularly among the Navajo. These indigenous soldiers used their language to create an unbreakable code used in Pacific communications. Their contributions were classified for years, but their legacy is now honored. Domestically, the war had accelerated social change. African Americans served in segregated units but returned demanding civil rights. Japanese Americans were interned in camps despite many being US citizens, a decision now widely condemned. The GI Bill gave returning veterans access to education and housing, fueling post-war prosperity. Historians still debate whether the atomic bomb was necessary. Some argue it saved millions of lives by ending the war quickly. Others suggest Japan was already on the brink of surrender, and that the bombs were meant to demonstrate power to the Soviet Union. The ethical debate continues to this day. The war ended with the United States as one of two superpowers. Alongside the Soviet Union, Europe was divided, the United Nations was founded, and a new kind of war, colder, quieter, but no less dangerous, was just beginning. World War II had started as a fight against fascism and conquest. It ended by creating a new world order, with the United States not just a participant in global affairs, but now one of its central architects. After the victory in World War II, the United States emerged as a global superpower, but peace proved fragile. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union quickly unraveled, replaced by suspicion, rivalry, and fear. What followed was a geopolitical standoff known as the Cold War. a contest not just of arms but of ideologies, democracy and capitalism on one side, communism and authoritarianism on the other. The first true test of this new global order came in Korea. The Korean peninsula had been divided at the end of World War II. The north was occupied by Soviet forces, and the south by American troops. The division, originally meant to be temporary, hardened into two separate governments: the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, led by Kim Il-sung, and the Republic of Korea in the south, led by Syngman-rhee. Each claimed to be the legitimate ruler of all Korea. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and launched a surprise invasion of the south. Armed with Soviet equipment and training, they quickly overran much of the country, capturing Seoul within days. The United States, viewing this as a critical test of containment policy, the effort to stop the spread of communism, moved swiftly. Under the banner of the United Nations, American troops and their allies intervened. President Harry Truman, fearing a repeat of Nazi aggression, committed forces without a formal declaration of war. It was the first major conflict of the Cold War, and it set the tone for what would follow. Limited wars fought in distant lands, often without clear victory. The initial American forces, unprepared and under-equipped, were pushed back to a small corner of Southeast Korea, around the city of Pusan. There they held a defensive perimeter until reinforcements arrived. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched a bold amphibious assault at Incheon, far behind enemy lines. The landing was a success, forcing North Korean troops to retreat. US and South Korean forces recaptured Seoul and advanced north, nearing the Chinese border. But the war took a dramatic turn. In late 1950, Chinese forces entered the conflict in massive numbers. Citing security concerns, China pushed back with overwhelming force, driving the UN troops south again. The conflict settled into a brutal stalemate around the original dividing line at the 38th parallel. Fighting was fierce and often miserable. Winters were bitter, terrain mountainous, and the front lines constantly shifting. One of the most infamous battles was the Chosin Reservoir Campaign, where American and Allied forces were surrounded by Chinese troops in freezing conditions. The retreat, though tactically sound, came at great cost. The Korean War was also notable for its air combat. It marked the first time jet aircraft fought in large numbers, with US F-86 Sabres battling Soviet-built MiG-15s in dogfights over MiG Alley. On the ground, artillery and machine guns dominated, and civilians suffered enormously. Entire cities were leveled. Over 2 million Korean civilians are estimated to have died. Domestically, the war deepened Cold War anxieties. Anti-communist sentiment surged, the US military budget ballooned, and when General MacArthur publicly criticized Truman's refusal to bomb China, he was relieved of command. One of the most dramatic acts of civil-military tension in American history. A lesser-known but significant aspect of the war was the desegregation of US forces. President Truman had ordered the military to integrate in 1948, and Korea was the first war where black and white soldiers fought side by side in officially desegregated units. It marked a quiet but important shift in American military culture. By 1953, both sides were exhausted. An armistice was signed on July 27, establishing a demilitarized zone, DMZ, that still exists today. No formal peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war. The US suffered over 36,000 combat deaths. South Korea lost hundreds of thousands more. The North Korean and Chinese tolls were higher still. Yet, the territorial outcome was essentially a draw. The peninsula remained divided, just as it had been at the start. Historians continue to debate the war's significance. Some view it as a successful example of containment, the first time a communist advance had been stopped by force. Others see it as a tragic, inconclusive conflict that set the stage for even greater Cold War confrontations. One curious legacy, the Korean War, has sometimes been called the Forgotten War. Overshadowed by World War II, before it, and Vietnam after, it occupies an ambiguous place in American memory, yet its effects are still very real. The DMZ remains one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. North Korea, isolated and authoritarian, remains a nuclear-armed flashpoint, and the US-South Korea alliance, born of war, continues to shape geopolitics in East Asia. For the United States, the Korean War introduced a new kind of conflict: open combat without total war, ideological battle without clear victory. It would not be the last time American troops were sent to fight a war that was technically undeclared, strategically murky, and politically polarizing. In the years after the Korean War, the United States doubled down on its strategy of containment. The Cold War became a global chess match, and nowhere did it grow more tangled and more tragic than in Vietnam. The Vietnam War would become the longest and most controversial conflict in US history up to that point. It began with caution, escalated into a full-scale military commitment, and ended with helicopters lifting off the rooftop of an embassy as a city fell. The roots of the war lay in the collapse of French colonial rule. Vietnam had been a French colony, but after World War II, nationalist forces led by Ho Chi Minh sought independence. In 1954, after a brutal campaign, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the north under Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and the south led by a fragile, US-backed regime under Ngo Dinh Diem. American support for South Vietnam began quietly, with military advisors and economic aid, but by the early 1960s, that support expanded. The fear was clear: if South Vietnam fell, other countries in Southeast Asia might follow. This was the domino theory, a Cold War belief that a single communist victory could trigger a regional collapse. By 1965, the US commitment deepened. After a reported attack on American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, an incident whose details remain contested, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to use military force. What followed was a massive escalation. Hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed. The conflict became a full-scale war, though it was never officially declared. The US strategy relied on overwhelming firepower, airstrikes, artillery, and large search and destroy missions. But the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force in the south, used terrain, tunnels, and hit-and-run tactics to their advantage. Vietnam's dense jungles, mountainous terrain, and humid climate made conventional warfare difficult. Soldiers faced not only enemy fire but booby traps, ambushes, and exhausting conditions. Helicopters became the lifeline of the war, used for transport, medical evacuation, and attack. Napalm and Agent Orange, chemical weapons designed to defoliate forests, caused long-term environmental and health effects. Public support for the war was strong at first, but it eroded quickly. As casualties mounted and progress remained elusive, protests erupted across the US. The draft was especially contentious, pulling young men into a war many no longer believed in. College campuses became flashpoints, with demonstrations sometimes ending in violence, most famously at Kent State University in 1970, where National Guard troops shot and killed 4 students. One of the most dramatic shifts came in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, including a brief but shocking assault on the US Embassy in Saigon. Though the offensive was repelled, it shook public confidence. The war, Americans were told, was nearly won. Tet proved otherwise. In 1969, President Richard Nixon introduced Vietnamization, a policy aimed at gradually withdrawing American troops, while training and equipping South Vietnamese forces to take over. At the same time, US bombing campaigns intensified, extending into neighboring Laos and Cambodia in efforts to cut off enemy supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These secretive operations sparked outrage when revealed. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970 triggered massive protests at home. The war was no longer just a military crisis, it was a political and cultural one, dividing the country in ways that echoed far beyond the battlefield. By 1973, a ceasefire agreement was reached in Paris. US troops withdrew, and American prisoners of war were released. But fighting between North and South Vietnam resumed almost immediately. In April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The South Vietnamese government collapsed, and desperate scenes played out as American helicopters evacuated remaining personnel from rooftops. Historians still debate nearly every aspect of the Vietnam War. Some see it as a necessary stand against communism, others as a catastrophic miscalculation. Many argue the US misunderstood Vietnamese nationalism, assuming it was a mere extension of global communism. The war also exposed the limits of American military power. Victory in battle did not translate to political success. A lesser-known element of the conflict was the role of technology. Vietnam saw the widespread use of computerized logistics, early smart bombs and real-time battlefield data. But this high-tech warfare clashed with the realities of guerrilla resistance and political complexity. One strange footnote: in 1967, a group of protesters attempted to levitate the Pentagon using psychic energy as a symbolic anti-war act. While the building stayed firmly grounded, the moment captured the surreal cultural tension of the era. The war left deep scars. Over 58,000 Americans were killed. Millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians died. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, displaced, or traumatized. Veterans returned home to a country that was often indifferent or hostile. The psychological toll was immense, and many struggled for years with post-traumatic stress. The legacy of Vietnam reshaped US foreign policy. Lawmakers passed the War Powers Act in 1973 to limit presidential authority to wage war without congressional approval. Military leaders re-examined doctrine, strategy, and readiness, and the phrase "no more Vietnams" became shorthand for avoiding prolonged, unpopular foreign wars without clear objectives. Vietnam was not just a war, it was a reckoning about power, morality, and the very meaning of victory. It left a generation divided, a nation humbled, and a shadow that would stretch across every future American conflict. Even as the Vietnam War raged publicly, another layer of conflict unfolded in the shadows. The Cold War wasn't fought solely on battlefields. It was also waged in embassies, jungles, and smoke-filled rooms, in covert operations, political manipulations, and proxy wars. During the second half of the 20th century, the United States became deeply involved in secret wars and foreign coups, often without a single shot fired by a uniformed soldier, at least not one officially on the record. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, created in 1947, quickly became a key player in this quieter form of warfare. Its mission wasn't just intelligence gathering, it was also covert action, and from the 1950s onward, the agency was involved in a series of operations to influence, destabilize, or outright overthrow governments that were viewed as leaning too far toward communism, or in some cases simply threatening American business interests. One of the earliest and most infamous examples came in Iran in 1953. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist, had moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry, previously controlled by British companies. Fearing both a loss of Western influence and a possible communist drift, the CIA helped organize protests, bribed officials, and supported a military coup that removed Mossadegh from power. The Shah of Iran, a pro-Western monarch, was restored, ruling for decades, until his own overthrow in 19... The event left deep resentment and remains a key point of tension in US-Iranian relations. Just a year later, in 1954, the CIA carried out a similar operation in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz had introduced land reforms that threatened the holdings of the United Fruit Company, a powerful American corporation. With Cold War fear as justification, the US backed a military coup that toppled Arbenz. The long-term result was political instability and a decades-long civil war that claimed over 200,000 lives. These weren't isolated incidents. In the Congo, the CIA supported efforts to remove Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, who was later assassinated. In Chile, it backed General Augusto Pinochet's 1973 coup against elected socialist President Salvador Allende. In Indonesia, covert support was funneled to the military during a violent anti-communist purge in the mid-1960s that killed hundreds of thousands. Each of these actions was justified under the logic of Cold War strategy: contain communism at all costs, prevent another Cuba, keep the global balance from tipping. But the human consequences were vast. Regimes installed with American help were often repressive and brutal. US credibility suffered, especially in the eyes of nations that saw democracy as a tool of convenience rather than principle. At the same time, covert wars turned increasingly military. In Southeast Asia, even as the Vietnam War dominated headlines, the CIA was running a massive secret war in Laos. There, the US supported local fighters, mostly Hmong tribesmen, against communist Pathet Lao forces. American aircraft flew thousands of bombing missions, making Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Much of this went unreported to the American public at the time. Another Cold War hotspot was Angola. When civil war broke out after the country's independence from Portugal in 1975, the US backed one faction, the Soviet Union backed another, and Cuba sent troops. It was a Cold War proxy war in everything but name. The same happened in Nicaragua, where the US supported right-wing Contra rebels against the leftist Sandinista government, despite widespread reports of Contra human rights abuses. The Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s exposed how far these covert actions could go. Senior US officials secretly sold arms to Iran, despite an arms embargo, and used the proceeds to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, bypassing Congress. The scandal didn't bring down the Reagan administration, but it laid bare the extent to which US foreign policy had been conducted behind closed doors. Historians continue to debate the effectiveness of these interventions. Some argue they successfully countered Soviet influence and prevented broader wars. Others point to the long-term destabilization they caused. Civil wars, authoritarian regimes, and anti-American sentiment that sometimes exploded into open conflict. One lesser-known operation was in Afghanistan, long before the US invasion in 2001. In the 1980s, the CIA funneled weapons and support to Afghan Mujahideen fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. Among the groups that benefited from this aid was the network that would later evolve into the Taliban, and indirectly, Al-Qaeda. At the time, they were seen as freedom fighters. Later, the blowback would be devastating. There were also bizarre moments. In Cuba, the CIA attempted to assassinate Fidel Castro through a series of increasingly strange methods: exploding cigars, poisoned wetsuits, and even a plan to sabotage his beard to make him appear weak. None of it worked. Castro outlived 9 US presidents. Despite their secrecy, many of these actions shaped public trust. Congressional investigations in the 1970s, like the Church Committee hearings, revealed decades of covert activity, leading to reforms and greater oversight, at least on paper. But covert operations didn't stop, they simply evolved. These secret wars rarely involved declarations or battlefield medals. But they were wars nonetheless, fought through intermediaries, fueled by ideology, and often forgotten by the public. Their legacy lives on in strained alliances, regional instability, and deep cynicism about American motives abroad. The Cold War was a long, patient struggle, sometimes loud, sometimes hidden. And while it never erupted into direct conflict between superpowers, its battles, both seen and unseen, left a trail of consequences that would echo long after the Iron Curtain fell. By the 1990s, the Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union dissolved, the Berlin Wall fell, and communism no longer shaped American foreign policy with the same urgency. But war didn't vanish, it simply changed shape. In 1990, the United States was drawn into a new kind of conflict in the Middle East, this time not over ideology, but over oil, alliances, and regional stability. The result was Operation Desert Storm, the military phase of the Gulf War. The crisis began when Iraq, under the rule of Saddam Hussein, invaded neighboring Kuwait in August 1919. Hussein accused Kuwait of slant drilling into Iraqi oil fields and overproducing oil in ways that lowered global prices, hurting Iraq's economy. But beyond economic grievances, the invasion was widely seen as an aggressive power grab. Kuwait was quickly occupied, and its government exiled. The international response was swift. The United Nations condemned the invasion and imposed sanctions. The US, under President George H.W. Bush, assembled a coalition of 35 nations, including many Arab states. The rationale was clear: prevent further aggression in a region vital to global oil supplies, defend an ally, and send a message that unprovoked invasions would not be tolerated in the post-Cold War order. Throughout the fall of 1990, coalition forces built up in Saudi Arabia, The operation, dubbed Desert Shield, involved the largest American military deployment since Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of troops were stationed in the desert, waiting for a diplomatic breakthrough, or failing that, a green light for combat. When Hussein refused to withdraw, the air war began on January 17, 1991. For over a month, US and coalition aircraft bombarded Iraqi military targets, command centers, communication lines, and infrastructure. Stealth bombers, cruise missiles, and smart bombs were used in large numbers for the first time, showcasing a new era of high-tech warfare. The air campaign was devastating. Iraqi defenses were overwhelmed, and much of the military's capacity was crippled before ground troops ever moved in. On February 24, the ground offensive, Operation Desert Storm, was launched. In just 100 hours, coalition forces swept into Kuwait, crushed Iraqi resistance, and liberated the country. Casualties were remarkably low for the coalition, just under 300 killed, compared to tens of thousands of Iraqi troops. But the war raised serious questions. Why hadn't the US removed Saddam Hussein while they had the chance? President Bush chose not to push into Baghdad, citing the limits of the UN mandate and the risk of destabilizing Iraq and the region. Critics argued this allowed Hussein to remain in power and brutally suppress internal uprisings, particularly among the Kurds and Shiites. Historians still debate whether that restraint was a wise decision or a missed opportunity. Some suggest that removing Hussein would have created a power vacuum, potentially leading to chaos. Others argue that leaving him in place set the stage for further conflict. One of the war's more surreal features was its media coverage. It was the first conflict to be broadcast live on cable television, particularly by CNN. Viewers watched green-tinted night vision footage of bombs falling on Baghdad in real time. The phrase "smart bomb" entered the popular lexicon, creating an image of clean, precise warfare, though the reality on the ground was far messier. A lesser-known detail: thousands of coalition troops suffered from what became known as Gulf War syndrome, a mysterious cluster of symptoms including fatigue, memory problems, and chronic pain. The exact cause remains debated, with theories ranging from chemical exposure to vaccines to stress-related conditions. Another quirk of the war: while technology dazzled, the environment became a secondary battlefield. In retreat, Iraqi forces set fire to over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells, creating a blackened sky that burned for months. The fires were eventually extinguished by international crews. They left behind serious environmental damage and a chilling image of modern scorched earth tactics. The war also marked a shift in military doctrine. Fast, overwhelming force, with minimal casualties, became the new standard. What some military thinkers called the Powell Doctrine, named after General Colin Powell. It emphasized clear objectives, overwhelming force, and a clear exit strategy. Yet for all its apparent success, Desert Storm didn't bring lasting peace. Iraq remained under heavy sanctions, and tensions simmered. American planes patrolled no-fly zones over Iraqi airspace for more than a decade. The region stayed volatile, and Saddam Hussein's regime remained a point of international friction. In the United States, the war produced a surge of patriotic pride. Troops were welcomed home with parades, a sharp contrast to the Vietnam era. The military regained prestige, and for a time, it seemed America had learned how to fight clean, decisive wars again. But beneath the surface, the conflict exposed the complexities of Middle Eastern politics, the fragility of international coalitions, and the difficulty of achieving lasting outcomes through military force alone. The Gulf War had ended quickly, but it had not truly ended anything. What it did, perhaps most significantly, was establish the United States as the dominant post-Cold War military power. No longer opposed by the Soviet Union, the US acted with a new confidence, setting precedents that would guide foreign policy for the next 3 decades. Sometimes with success, sometimes with costly consequences. Just 2 years after the triumph of Operation Desert Storm, the United States found itself embroiled in a much smaller, far less clear-cut mission, this time in Somalia. It began as a humanitarian effort, aimed at stopping mass starvation and restoring order in a country shattered by civil war. But it quickly turned violent, confused, and politically toxic. The Battle of Mogadishu in 1993 would come to define the operation, and cast a long shadow over future American interventions. Somalia, located on the Horn of Africa, had descended into chaos after the fall of its dictator, Mohammed Siad Barre. In 1991, competing clans and warlords carved the country into armed zones, and the central government effectively ceased to exist. A famine followed, killing hundreds of thousands. Aid workers tried to distribute food, but much of it was looted or blocked by militias. In December 1992, President George H.W. Bush authorized Operation Restore Hope, a US-led, UN-backed mission to secure the delivery of humanitarian aid. American troops landed to relatively little resistance, and for a brief period, the operation appeared to work. Food reached starving populations, and violence temporarily declined. But as the mission expanded under President Bill Clinton, the goal shifted. What had started as food relief turned into a broader attempt at nation-building and disarming local warlords. Particularly Mohammed Farah Aidid, the most powerful militia leader in Mogadishu. Aidid viewed the UN presence as a threat to his control and began attacking peacekeepers. In response, US Special Operations Forces launched a mission in October 1993 to capture two of Aidid's top lieutenants. It was meant to be a quick raid, less than an hour. Instead, it became a running gun battle through the streets of Mogadishu. Two Black Hawk helicopters were shot down by rocket-propelled grenades. American troops, trapped in hostile territory, fought their way through dense urban combat. Rescue efforts were delayed by miscommunication and intense enemy fire. By the time the fighting ended, 18 US soldiers were dead, over 70 wounded, and hundreds of Somali militia members and civilians had been killed. Television footage of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets shocked the public. The battle, later popularized in books and films as Black Hawk Down, became a turning point. The mission was scaled back, and within months, US forces were withdrawn entirely. Other UN peacekeepers soon followed. Historians continue to debate what went wrong. Was the mission doomed by mission creep? When goals expand beyond their original scope, were political leaders too quick to abandon the operation after one high-profile failure? Or was the premise flawed from the start, expecting short-term military intervention to solve deep-rooted political and social collapse? A lesser-known aspect of the battle is the role of Pakistani and Malaysian UN forces, who played critical parts in rescuing American troops. Their contributions were often underreported, but they were instrumental in preventing a larger disaster. One strange detail: during the operation, American forces had detailed satellite imagery and advanced surveillance, but lacked adequate maps of the city's narrow streets. The terrain was unfamiliar, and the enemy fought on their own terms. The US had entered expecting light resistance, but instead faced an entrenched, mobile, and motivated urban force. The aftermath of Mogadishu affected US foreign policy for years. It fed into a growing reluctance to get involved in humanitarian or peacekeeping missions without clear goals and exit strategies. When genocide unfolded in Rwanda just 6 months later, the US stayed out. The memory of Somalia, haunting and unresolved, hung heavily over every decision. Domestically, the battle spurred new discussions about military readiness, the limits of force, and the cost of unclear missions. In the military, the experience led to better coordination between special forces, air support, and intelligence. Tactics were revised, and equipment was upgraded, including the addition of armored Humvees for urban operations. One term that emerged from the experience was the Mogadishu line, a metaphor for the point at which a peacekeeping mission turns into open combat. Crossing that line without preparation, the thinking went, could lead to disaster. The Somalia mission had started with hope, an attempt to ease human suffering without conquest or empire. But it ended in chaos, revealing the limits of American power in fractured states. It also served as a cautionary tale that even the best intentions, when matched with poor planning and unrealistic expectations, could lead to tragedy. And yet, Somalia was not forgotten. In later years, extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab would cite the US withdrawal as evidence that American forces lacked the stomach for prolonged conflict. The ghosts of Mogadishu would return, different deserts, under different names, but never fully erased from the playbook of modern war. While Somalia had exposed the challenges of humanitarian intervention, the 1990s weren't done testing America's willingness to use force for moral or strategic purposes. The next major conflict involving US forces took place in the Balkans, a region long shaped by complex histories and old grudges. The collapse of Yugoslavia, a multi-ethnic socialist federation in southeastern Europe, triggered a series of brutal wars. The most prominent of these, particularly for the United States, was the war in Bosnia. Yugoslavia had been a patchwork of republics held together under the rule of Josip Broz Tito. After his death in 1980 and the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, nationalist tensions resurfaced. In 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. Both moves triggered fighting, but it was the conflict in Bosnia, starting in 1992, that became the most devastating and the one that ultimately drew in NATO, and with it, the United States. Bosnia was home to Bosniaks, mostly Muslim, Serbs, mostly Orthodox Christian, and Croats, mostly Catholic, all of whom had lived under the Yugoslav umbrella. When Bosnia declared independence, ethnic Serb leaders, with backing from the Serbian government under Slobodan Milošević, opposed the move and sought to carve out their own territory. What followed was a campaign of ethnic cleansing massacres, forced displacements, and the systematic targeting of civilians. By the mid-1990s, over 100,000 people had died, and more than 2 million had been displaced. Entire towns were destroyed. Civilians were trapped under siege, the most infamous being Sarajevo, which endured constant shelling and sniper fire for nearly 4 years. Images of starving families, ruined cities, and mass graves reached global audiences, and pressure grew for international intervention. The United Nations initially deployed peacekeepers, but they were lightly armed and largely ineffective in stopping violence. NATO began limited airstrikes in 1994, but it wasn't until 1995, after the massacre at Srebrenica, where over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed by Bosnian Serb forces, that momentum shifted. The atrocity, widely regarded as the worst in Europe since World War II, galvanized Western powers. Under US leadership, NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force in August 1995, a sustained bombing campaign against Bosnian Serb military targets. It was one of the first times NATO used force in its history, and it signaled a new willingness to act outside of strict self-defense. The campaign helped push the warring factions toward negotiations. In December 1995, the Dayton Accords were signed in Ohio, bringing an uneasy peace to Bosnia. The agreement created a single state with 2 entities, one Serb-dominated, the other shared by Bosniaks and Croats, under a weak central government. It was a political compromise, not a moral resolution, but it stopped the killing. The United States played a central role in both the military and diplomatic efforts. President Bill Clinton, initially reluctant to get involved, became a key driver of the peace process. American troops, as part of a larger NATO force, were deployed to enforce the agreement. They remained in Bosnia for years, helping to stabilize the fragile peace. One of the war's lesser-known aspects was the use of technology for intelligence gathering. American reconnaissance planes, drones, and satellite imagery played a crucial role in identifying targets and verifying war crimes. It marked a shift toward a more surveillance-heavy model of modern warfare. Historians still debate whether intervention came too late. Some argue that early decisive action could have prevented the worst atrocities. Others believe the ethnic divisions were too deep and the situation too complex for easy solutions. What's clear is that Bosnia reshaped how the West viewed its role in post-Cold War conflicts. The lessons of Bosnia also influenced future policy. The idea of humanitarian intervention, using military force to prevent genocide or mass atrocities, gained traction. It was a stark contrast to the hands-off approach in Rwanda the year before, where nearly 1 million people had been killed without international intervention. One curious detail: the peace talks in Dayton were deliberately held at a military base to limit distractions and keep negotiators isolated. The strategy worked. After weeks of tense discussions, the deal was struck, though the peace it delivered remains fragile to this day. The US experience in Bosnia was markedly different from Vietnam or Somalia. It was multilateral, relatively short, and successful in halting violence. But it also revealed the limits of post-war peacekeeping. Ethnic tensions remained. Political institutions were weak, and while the war had ended, justice was slow. War crimes trials would take years, and many victims never saw closure. The Bosnian War signaled that, even after the Cold War, Europe was not immune to bloodshed. It also showed that US power, when used carefully and in coordination with allies, could make a difference, even in conflicts rooted in centuries of division. For the United States, Bosnia marked a return to Europe, not to counter communism, but to confront a different kind of violence. The war had not threatened American soil or trade routes, but it had challenged America's conscience, and for once, the guns were brought in, not for conquest or defense, but to stop a nation from tearing itself apart. In the early morning hours of September 11, 2001, 4 commercial airliners were hijacked by 19 members of the Islamist extremist group Al-Qaeda. 2 were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon in Virginia, and the 4th, United Flight 93, crashed in a Pennsylvania field after passengers attempted to retake the aircraft. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the attacks, the deadliest foreign assault on American soil in history. The event transformed US foreign and domestic policy overnight. Within weeks, President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror, a broad and open-ended campaign against terrorist groups and the states that harbored them. The first target was Afghanistan, home to Al-Qaeda's leadership, and its host, the Taliban regime. The US invasion of Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom, began on October 7, 2001. The goal was to dismantle Al-Qaeda, capture or kill Osama bin Laden, and remove the Taliban from power. American forces, supported by British and other NATO allies, quickly toppled the Taliban government. By the end of the year, a new interim government was installed, and Al-Qaeda's camps were dismantled. But the war didn't end there. Taliban fighters melted into the mountains and rural areas, launching a sustained insurgency. Al-Qaeda dispersed, with many members fleeing to Pakistan. Meanwhile, the US and its allies began the long, complex task of nation-building, establishing a new Afghan government, training military and police forces, and trying to stabilize a country that had been at war, in one form or another, for decades. For a time, progress seemed possible. Schools reopened. Women, previously banned from public life under Taliban rule, returned to classrooms and workplaces in major cities. National elections were held. But the deeper the US commitment became, the more difficult it was to define what victory meant. The Taliban regrouped. Corruption plagued the Afghan government. Rural areas remained contested. American forces faced roadside bombs, ambushes, and shifting alliances. NATO partners contributed troops and aid, but Afghanistan proved resistant to outside templates for democracy and stability. One of the war's key moments came in May 2011, nearly a decade after the attacks. US Navy SEALs found and killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, during a covert raid. It was a major symbolic victory, but by then, the war in Afghanistan had evolved into something far broader than a manhunt. The war stretched into its second decade. Multiple US administrations adjusted strategy, troop surges, drawdowns, and attempts at peace talks. At its peak, over 100,000 American troops were stationed in Afghanistan. The costs were staggering. Over 2,400 US military deaths, tens of thousands of Afghan civilian deaths, and over $2 trillion spent. Historians still debate the feasibility of the mission. Was it possible to defeat a decentralized insurgency in a country with a long history of resisting foreign occupation? Did the US focus too heavily on military solutions at the expense of political ones? Or was the real error staying too long with unclear goals? One detail often missed. Afghanistan was also an intelligence war. Drone strikes, surveillance, and special operations played as large a role as traditional ground combat. Technology advanced quickly. Real-time targeting, biometric abatis, and artificial intelligence were all tested in the Afghan theater. And yet, for all the hardware, the war remained deeply human and personal. Soldiers rotated through multiple tours, facing physical danger and psychological strain. Civilians caught between the Taliban and foreign forces, endured bombings, raids, and poverty. Afghan interpreters, who risked their lives to work with Americans, later found themselves targets as the war dragged on. A curious quirk of the war was the reliance on forward operating bases, small self-contained outposts in remote areas. These became temporary towns, complete with coffee shops, gyms, and internet connections, even as firefights erupted just outside the wire. Despite years of training and billions in aid, the Afghan government remained fragile. In 2020, the US negotiated directly with the Taliban in Doha, bypassing the Afghan government entirely. The deal promised a phased withdrawal in exchange for Taliban commitments to curb terrorism. Critics warned that the terms were vague and unenforceable. In August 2021, the withdrawal was completed under President Joe Biden, but the Afghan military collapsed faster than almost anyone predicted. The Taliban retook Kabul without major resistance. Images of desperate civilians flooding the airport, clinging to planes, and pleading for evacuation dominated the news. The war ended where it had begun, amid confusion, violence, and a sudden power vacuum. It had been America's longest war. Some call it a failure of execution. Others argue it was doomed by unrealistic goals and cultural blind spots. What's clear is that the war reshaped American military doctrine, foreign policy, and public trust. The promise of a quick mission had become a generational commitment, and in the end, the Taliban was back in power. The war in Afghanistan wasn't just about counterterrorism or democracy. It was about how the US responded to fear, ambition, and loss. It tested the limits of military power and the meaning of victory in the modern world. And while the headlines faded, the consequences, political, emotional, and strategic, remain very much alive. While US forces were still deeply engaged in Afghanistan, another front opened, this time in Iraq. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was one of the most debated and consequential decisions in modern American history. It was a war that began with a preemptive strike, was justified with shifting explanations, and evolved into a prolonged and chaotic occupation. The groundwork was laid in the aftermath of 9/11. President George W. Bush and members of his administration argued that Saddam Hussein, Iraq's authoritarian leader, posed a threat to the United States. The central claim was that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and could provide them to terrorists. Though Saddam had no direct link to the 9/11 attacks, the atmosphere of fear and urgency helped build public and political support for action. On March 20, 2003, the US launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. The invasion began with a rapid, high-tech military assault. In just weeks, coalition forces seized Baghdad, and Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. The initial combat phase was swift and overwhelming, much like Desert Storm a decade earlier. But what followed was far less tidy. Saddam was captured later that year, tried, and eventually executed, but no stockpiles of WMDs were ever found. The intelligence used to justify the war proved deeply flawed or misrepresented. The central rationale for the invasion collapsed, and the conflict shifted into a long, grinding insurgency. Iraq quickly descended into chaos. Looting broke out. Government ministries were ransacked. The Coalition Provisional Authority, created to govern Iraq temporarily, made a series of controversial decisions, chief among them the disbanding of the Iraqi army and the de-Baathification policy, which removed members of Saddam's party from public roles. Both moves created a power vacuum and fueled resentment, pushing many Iraqis into insurgent groups. American troops faced roadside bombs, sniper attacks, and suicide bombings. By 2004, resistance had hardened. The battles of Fallujah that year became symbols of urban warfare's brutality. Insurgents, some linked to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, used guerrilla tactics in dense city environments, turning house-to-house combat into a deadly, disorienting experience. One of the war's most controversial episodes occurred at Abu Ghraib prison, where images of US personnel abusing Iraqi detainees sparked global outrage. The scandal undermined US credibility and fueled anti-American sentiment throughout the Middle East. Amid the violence, Iraqis held elections, formed new governments, and debated a new constitution. But sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia communities intensified. The destruction of the Al-Askari Mosque in 2006 triggered a wave of killings, pushing the country towards civil war. In response, President George W. Bush announced a troop surge in 2007. Led by General David Petraeus, the strategy involved increasing U.S. troop levels, protecting local populations, and partnering with Sunni tribal leaders to combat extremists. The surge reduced violence in the short term, but the underlying political and sectarian divisions remained. Historians continue to debate whether the surge was a tactical success or a delay of the inevitable. What's clear is that the cost was staggering. Over 4,400 American troops were killed. Tens of thousands more were wounded. Civilian deaths in Iraq numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Millions were displaced. One lesser-known aspect of the occupation was the role of private military contractors. Firms like Blackwater operated in parallel with the military, often in security or logistical roles. Their presence complicated the chain of command and raised legal and ethical questions, especially after incidents like the 2007 Nisour Square massacre, where Blackwater contractors killed 17 Iraqi civilians. A strange historical footnote: during the early occupation, US forces attempted to jumpstart Iraq's economy by flying in literal planeloads of cash, mostly US dollars. Billions went missing, unaccounted for in the fog of war, fueling corruption and further undermining public trust. By the time American combat troops officially withdrew in 2011, Iraq was a changed country, but not a stable one. The US left behind a fragile democracy, deeply divided, with limited capacity to resist new threats. And those threats came quickly. In the years that followed, the extremist group known as ISIS, born from remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and fueled by the Syrian civil war, seized large parts of the country. Their brutality shocked even hardened observers. In 2014, the US returned to Iraq, this time as part of a multinational campaign to defeat ISIS. But that marked the beginning of a new chapter, not a continuation of the old war, but not entirely separate from it either. The Iraq War forced a reckoning in the United States. It exposed the limitations of preemptive war, the dangers of faulty intelligence, and the unpredictability of regime change. It strained alliances and intensified political divisions at home. Was the war a failure? Success? Historians don't agree. Some argue that removing Saddam eliminated a dangerous dictator. Others say the war created more instability than it resolved. Many Iraqis experienced both suffering and liberation, and for some, the two were inseparable. The Iraq War didn't end with a surrender or a peace treaty. It faded into a series of new missions, new enemies, and new headlines. But its legacy lives on, in damaged credibility, in lives lost, and in the caution that followed about when and why the United States chooses to go to war. After years of intense fighting in Iraq, the conflict entered a new phase in the late 2000s. Violence had not disappeared, but it had shifted. The chaos of the insurgency had given way to a new kind of challenge. Holding territory, training allies, and navigating the politics of a fragile, fractured state. This chapter of the war became defined by a military and political strategy known as the surge. The surge wasn't just a troop increase. It was an all-in gamble to stop Iraq's descent into full civil war. In 2007, President George W. Bush announced that more than 20,000 additional US troops would be deployed, primarily to secure Baghdad and Anbar province, two of the most violent areas at the time. But the real shift was in philosophy. Instead of focusing primarily on chasing insurgents, US forces aimed to protect civilians, establishing local security, building trust, and turning neighborhoods into defensible spaces. This was classic counterinsurgency, or COIN in military terms. The idea was to win the support of the population rather than simply defeat the enemy in open battle. General David Petraeus, a key architect of the strategy, emphasized building relationships with local leaders. One of the most significant developments during the surge was the Sunni Awakening, a movement in which Sunni tribal militias, once hostile to US forces, began cooperating with them to drive out al-Qaeda in Iraq. These local fighters were organized into units known as the Sons of Iraq and were paid stipends by the US military. Violence dropped. Sectarian killings declined. Baghdad became more stable. From a military perspective, the surge was considered a tactical success. It gave Iraqi forces breathing room, and it allowed for a greater degree of control in previously lawless areas. But the success was fragile, and many of its gains depended on continued US presence and support. The political situation in Iraq had not fundamentally improved. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, viewed many as a sectarian figure, struggled to reconcile the country's Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish factions. Corruption remained rampant, and when the US began withdrawing troops, those unresolved tensions resurfaced. One of the great criticisms of the surge is that it bought time, but that time wasn't used effectively. The Iraqi government failed to enact the reforms needed to maintain peace without foreign support, and many of the Sunni fighters from the Sons of Iraq were later abandoned or targeted by the same government they had helped defend. By 2011, when the US completed its withdrawal under President Barack Obama, there was a strong desire, politically and publicly, to close the chapter on Iraq. Troops came home, bases were shut down, and American attention shifted. But the conflict didn't stay buried. In 2013 and 2014, a new threat emerged from the ashes of al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, swept across large parts of northern and western Iraq, capturing cities like Fallujah and Mosul with shocking speed. Iraqi forces often abandoned their posts, and US-provided weapons were seized by the enemy. ISIS declared a caliphate, ruling territory with extreme brutality. Videos of executions, massacres, and the destruction of cultural sites horrified the world. In response, the US launched Operation Inherent Resolve, a renewed military campaign aimed at supporting Iraqi and Kurdish forces to retake territory and dismantle the group. This was not a repeat of the 2003 invasion. There were no massive troop deployments or city-by-city occupations by American infantry. Instead, US forces acted as advisors, air power providers, and intelligence partners. Drone strikes, special operations raids, and air campaigns became the new model. In time, with American support, ISIS was pushed back. Mosul was retaken in 2017 after a long, devastating battle, but the city lay in ruins, and the cost in civilian lives was immense. ISIS no longer held major territory, but it remained a threat, its fighters going underground, its ideology spreading through social media, and its branches emerging in other countries. A lesser-known detail from this era: American troops returned to some of the same bases and cities they had fought in a decade earlier, often finding them changed, damaged, or under new control. Some Iraqi units had improved, others had collapsed. For many soldiers, the experience felt like déjà vu, with fewer illusions and deeper skepticism. Another subtle but important change was in public tone. The early Iraq War had been filled with declarations of mission accomplished, democracy on the march, and battles between good and evil. By the time of the fight against ISIS, the language was more restrained. Fewer flags, more disclaimers. War had become a permanent background noise. Historians continue to assess the long-term impact of the surge in the Second Iraq Campaign. Was it a delay of collapse, or a necessary stabilization? Did it set a precedent for smarter interventions, or simply prolong an inevitable breakdown? The debate remains unresolved, but the legacy of this era in Iraq is undeniable. It reshaped how America viewed counterinsurgency, how it trained allies, and how it managed war fatigue at home. It showed that defeating an enemy on the battlefield did not mean winning a war, and that alliances, especially with fragile states, could vanish as quickly as they were formed. Most of all, it demonstrated that modern war is rarely about victory in the traditional sense. It's about pressure, positioning, and avoiding collapse long enough to hand off responsibility. Whether that's a sustainable model or a permanent cycle is a question still being answered. While the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan occupied much of America's military attention in the early 2000s, another intervention unfolded in 2011, this time in North Africa. The target was Libya, and the operation was brief, aerial, and controversial. It marked a new chapter in American warfare, one that prioritized coalition action, minimized boots on the ground, and relied heavily on air power and precision strikes. But like many modern interventions, its aftermath was far messier than its opening act. Libya had been ruled for over 4 decades by Muammar Gaddafi, a flamboyant and often brutal dictator known for his erratic behavior, long speeches, and eccentric dress. His regime was marked by repression, propaganda, and a cult of personality. He had also been a long-time antagonist of the West, responsible for the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. But by the 2000s, relations had begun to thaw. Gaddafi renounced weapons of mass destruction and began cooperating, at least publicly, with international powers. That uneasy détente collapsed during the Arab Spring of 2011. Popular uprisings erupted across the Middle East and North Africa, toppling autocratic governments in Tunisia and Egypt. In Libya, protests escalated quickly into armed rebellion. Gaddafi responded with characteristic fury, vowing to crush opposition forces like rats and threatening mass killings in cities like Benghazi. Faced with the prospect of a massacre, the United Nations Security Council authorized a no-fly zone over Libya in March 2011. The US, along with NATO allies including France and the United Kingdom, launched airstrikes under the banner of humanitarian intervention. The operation was dubbed Operation Odyssey Dawn. American warplanes, drones, and cruise missiles targeted Libyan air defenses, command centers, and military convoys. The goal was to prevent Gaddafi's forces from overrunning rebel-held cities. It was not framed as a war, but rather as a limited intervention. No US ground troops were deployed. Instead, support was provided to rebel groups, both directly and indirectly. The military campaign succeeded rapidly. Gaddafi's forces were weakened, and rebel fighters gained ground. By August 2011, they had entered Tripoli, the capital. In October, Gaddafi was captured and killed by rebel forces in his hometown of Sirte. Graphic footage of his final moments circulated widely, symbolizing both the end of an era and the raw chaos of regime change. With Gaddafi gone, the US and its allies faced a familiar challenge. What next? Libya descended into factionalism. Various militias, tribal groups, and political factions vied for control. The central government, weak and inexperienced, struggled to assert authority. Weapons from Gaddafi's massive stockpiles flowed across borders, fueling violence in neighboring countries. Some of these arms would later appear in conflicts as far away as Mali and Syria. Historians and policymakers quickly began to question the wisdom of the intervention. The initial rationale to prevent civilian slaughter was achieved, but the broader consequences were dire. Libya became a failed state, a haven for extremist groups, and a major conduit for human trafficking across the Mediterranean. One of the more overlooked facts: Libya, once largely closed off, became a major corridor for migrants and refugees after the war. Smuggling networks flourished, and the collapse of border control created a humanitarian crisis that Europe is still grappling with. Domestically, the Libya intervention became a point of political tension in the United States. While it had bipartisan support at the outset, criticism mounted over time. Some argued the US had overstepped its role in a NATO operation. Others claimed that the Obama administration had failed to plan for the aftermath. Echoes of Iraq in miniature. Perhaps the most enduring controversy surrounded the 2012 attack on the US diplomatic compound in Benghazi. Armed militants stormed the facility, killing Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 other Americans. The attack became a political flashpoint, sparking congressional investigations and heated debates over security failures and broader foreign policy strategy. Libya also became a case study in the risks of leading from behind, a phrase attributed to the Obama administration's approach. The idea was to support multilateral action without taking center stage. In theory, it reduced American overreach. In practice, it sometimes left power vacuums no one else could or would fill. One curious military innovation during the Libya campaign was the use of drone surveillance combined with real-time targeting from orbiting bombers. These systems allowed for high precision but also underscored the growing distance between the shooter and the battlefield. A defining feature of 21st century warfare. Historians still debate whether Libya was a humanitarian success or a strategic failure. Was it right to act quickly to stop an imminent atrocity, even if long-term consequences were uncertain, or did the lack of planning for the post-war environment make the intervention reckless? What's clear is that the Libya operation though short and low cost for the United States in terms of casualties, became a symbol of unintended consequences. It reinforced a pattern: rapid military victories followed by chaotic political collapse. And it showed that even well-intentioned interventions can leave behind broken states, emboldened militias, and unresolved trauma. Libya was not Iraq. It wasn't Afghanistan. It was its own story. But it carried the same lesson, repeated throughout American military history. Ending a war is not the same as winning the peace. While Libya spiraled into post-intervention chaos, another front in the so-called war on terror was heating up in Syria. What began in 2011 as a peaceful protest movement against President Bashar al-Assad quickly escalated into one of the most complex and brutal conflicts of the 21st century. Syria's civil war drew in regional powers, international actors, proxy forces, and extremist groups. Among them was the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, a name that would become synonymous with terror, brutality, and yet another American military campaign. The United States did not immediately intervene when protests in Syria were met with violent repression. But as the conflict deepened, the humanitarian toll became staggering. Cities were bombed into rubble, chemical weapons were used, refugee flows surged into neighboring countries and into Europe. By 2013, over 100,000 people had died, and millions had been displaced. The world was watching, and mostly hesitating. Then, ISIS seized global attention. Emerging from the wreckage of post-US invasion Iraq, ISIS exploited Syria's civil war to establish a base of operations. In 2014, it shocked the world by capturing the Iraqi city of Mosul, announcing a caliphate, and executing hostages in highly produced videos. Its fighters rampaged across Iraq and Syria, destroying cultural heritage, enslaving minorities, and imposing its brutal rule. The US response was swift but careful. In August 2014, airstrikes began against ISIS positions in Iraq. The campaign expanded into Syria shortly after, marking a significant escalation. Operation Inherent Resolve, an international coalition led by the US, was launched to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. But America did not send in large ground forces. This was a different kind of war. It relied on air power, intelligence, special operations, and partnerships with local forces, especially the Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF), a group largely composed of Kurdish fighters. Together, they began clawing back territory from ISIS in fierce, street-by-street battles. The most iconic of these was the battle for Raqqa, the de facto capital of the ISIS caliphate. By the time it fell in 2017, it was a hollowed-out ruin. The victory was real, but the cost to civilians and infrastructure was devastating. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Survivors were left with little more than ash and trauma. One of the war's strangest features was its patchwork of alliances. The US was backing Kurdish militias opposed by NATO ally Turkey. American troops sometimes found themselves operating in close proximity to Russian and Syrian government forces, with elaborate communication channels used to avoid accidental clashes. Even as ISIS lost its territory, the situation in Syria remained unstable. Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, had managed to hold on to power. His forces retook major cities with devastating airstrikes, often targeting hospitals, schools, and civilian shelters. Chemical weapons were used on multiple occasions. The US responded with limited missile strikes, symbolic shows of force that did little to alter the war's trajectory. At home, Americans debated the scope and purpose of US involvement. Was it about fighting terrorism, protecting civilians, countering Russia and Iran, or simply trying not to repeat the perceived mistakes of Iraq and Libya? A lesser-known component of the campaign was the extensive use of drones and precision-guided munitions. These tools allowed the US to hit targets with reduced risk to pilots, but they also raised questions about civilian casualties and the long-term psychological effects on drone operators. One odd military detail: US troops often worked out of hastily built outposts deep in the desert, surrounded by blast walls and camo netting. Many were so remote they received resupply via airdrop or long, treacherous convoys. Yet even in these isolated zones, connectivity was king. Satellite internet, real-time feeds, and encrypted comms made this one of the most tech-heavy wars in history. Historians and analysts still struggle to define what kind of war Syria became for the United States. It was never officially declared. Congress never voted on it. Troop levels fluctuated without clear timelines, and while the territorial caliphate of ISIS was destroyed, the group lived on as an insurgency. Meanwhile, American soldiers continued operating in Syria, often under vague or shifting legal authority. Administrations changed, strategy shifted, but the mission persisted. In many ways, Syria reflected a new model of US warfare: low visibility, minimal troop presence, no defined endpoint, and objectives that were more about management than resolution. The conflict also exposed deep divides in international policy. Russia's direct intervention to support Assad marked a return to major power rivalry in the Middle East. Iran's involvement expanded its regional influence, particularly through proxy militias, and Turkey's incursions against Kurdish groups put it at odds with US partners on the ground. For the people of Syria, the war became a never-ending nightmare. Over 500,000 killed, entire generations displaced, ancient cities turned to dust. The US may not have started the war, but its involvement added another layer to an already tangled catastrophe. By the early 2020s, the active phase of US combat had largely ended, but small numbers of troops remained. The mission had blurred, from defeating ISIS to containing instability, deterring adversaries, and protecting allies, all in a landscape where victory was no longer the measure of success. Syria didn't resemble traditional warfare. It was something more fragmented, more ambiguous, part counterterrorism, part humanitarianism, part geopolitical chess. For American military history, it marked another step into the gray zone, where enemies are hard to define, alliances are fragile, and even the end of the war doesn't mean the war is over. While Syria's war was grinding on, another lesser publicized US military campaign unfolded across borders and continents. A quiet, sprawling, and largely invisible series of operations collectively known as the Drone Wars. This new form of warfare relied not on soldiers storming beaches or tanks rolling through cities, but on targeted strikes from unmanned aerial vehicles, usually flown from half a world away. The origin of drone warfare stretches back to the early 2000s, but it matured during the Obama administration. The technology had evolved rapidly. Drones like the MQ-1 Predator, and later the MQ-9 Reaper, could loiter above targets for hours, equipped with high-resolution cameras, infrared sensors, and laser-guided missiles. From remote air bases, often in the US or allied countries, pilots and intelligence officers tracked individuals in real time, waiting for the moment to strike. The primary targets were high-ranking members of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, and affiliated militant groups. Most of the drone strikes occurred in Pakistan's tribal regions, Yemen, and Somalia, places where the US had limited on-the-ground presence and where traditional warfare would have been politically or logistically difficult. In theory, the appeal was obvious: precise, low-risk, and capable of eliminating threats without the costs of full-scale war. Some strikes clearly removed dangerous figures, others disrupted planned attacks. Supporters pointed to cases like Anwar al-Awlaki, a US-born cleric, who joined al-Qaeda and was killed in a 2011 drone strike in Yemen. But the reality was more complicated. Intelligence was imperfect. Militants operated among civilians. Mistakes were made. Reports emerged of weddings and funerals struck by accident. Entire families were killed because of misidentified vehicles or phone metadata. The term signature strike entered the lexicon. Attacks not based on a specific name, but on behavioral patterns deemed suspicious. These patterns were sometimes wrong. The legal framework for drone strikes operated in murky territory. Targets were often in countries where the US was not officially at war. Operations were authorized under the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, AUMF, a post-9/11 law that gave the president broad authority to pursue terrorist threats. But the further the years got from 2001, the looser those definitions became. Critics raised alarm over the lack of transparency. Most drone strikes were classified, casualty figures were disputed. Families of victims had little recourse. Even Congress struggled to access full details. Civil liberties groups warned that a policy of targeted killing without trial set a dangerous precedent. One strange, sobering detail: drone operators, though often stationed in climate-controlled facilities in Nevada or New Mexico, reported high levels of psychological stress. They watched targets for days, eating, walking, holding children before executing a strike. The emotional distance created by screens didn't eliminate the moral weight. For many, it intensified it. Despite the controversy, drone warfare expanded. Under Obama, drone strikes reached their peak in frequency. Under Trump, oversight rules were relaxed further, and strike authority was delegated more widely among military commanders. Targets included not just high-profile militants but mid-level operatives, suspected bomb makers, and logistical personnel. In Somalia, U.S. airstrikes targeted al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda-linked group. In Yemen, strikes aimed at al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQPA, continued. In Libya, occasional attacks targeted ISIS remnants. In the Philippines, drones were used to support counter-terrorism operations against Islamist insurgents. It was a low-profile, high-frequency battlefield. Supporters argued these operations kept Americans safer and reduced the need for large-scale deployments. Critics argued they created a cycle of resentment, radicalization, and blowback. Killing a terrorist leader might eliminate one threat, but could also fuel the next generation of fighters. One little-known fact: some drone bases used for these missions were located in places like Djibouti and Niger, countries rarely associated with frontline combat. These lily-pad bases formed a global archipelago of launch points, enabling operations far from public view. By the 2020s, drone warfare had become institutionalized. It wasn't an experiment, it was policy. Presidents could launch strikes without formal declarations of war. Technology allowed for pinpoint attacks, but policy struggled to keep pace. Questions lingered. Who was being targeted? How were they chosen? And what happened when mistakes occurred? Historians already debate whether this era represents the future of war or a dangerous detour. Some call it the most surgical form of modern conflict. Others see it as a system of extrajudicial killings normalized by convenience. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Drone warfare didn't dominate headlines the way Iraq or Afghanistan did. There were no dramatic battles, no flag-raising moments, just grainy infrared footage, a distant flash, and a line in a classified report. Yet in many ways it defined how America waged war in the 21st century, persistent, remote, and morally ambiguous, for a country increasingly wary of long occupations and body bags. Drones offered a tempting alternative, but with that temptation came a question: if war no longer requires sacrifice, will it also lose the caution that comes with cost? As the 21st century progressed, the nature of warfare continued to evolve, influenced by advances in technology, shifting geopolitical landscapes, and changes in military doctrine. Beyond the large-scale wars in the Middle East and Africa, the United States increasingly found itself engaged in smaller, more specialized conflicts, often labeled as counter-terrorism, counterinsurgency, or stability operations. These gray-zone wars were defined less by open battlefields and more by intelligence work, cyber operations, and special forces deployments. One prominent example is the ongoing fight against terrorist groups in places like the Sahel region of Africa, the Philippines, and Central Asia. Here, US forces worked closely with local militaries, providing training, intelligence, and limited direct support. These conflicts rarely made headlines, but they represented a significant commitment of resources and lives. Another development was the growing use of cyber warfare. Unlike traditional combat, cyber warfare involves hacking, espionage, and sabotage conducted in virtual spaces. The US government established dedicated cyber commands and increased investment in digital defenses and offenses. Cyber operations became integral to both deterrence and active conflict, capable of disrupting infrastructure, stealing secrets, or sowing confusion without a single bullet fired. At the same time, the military adapted to new threats posed by near-peer competitors like Russia and China. These nations had developed advanced missile systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and anti-access area denial strategies designed to challenge US dominance in potential conflict zones like the South China Sea or Eastern Europe. Preparing for these challenges led to renewed emphasis on naval power, space capabilities, and rapid technological innovation. Domestically, the military faced new challenges as well: budget constraints, recruitment struggles, and political debates about the use of force created tensions. Public opinion on war remained cautious, with many Americans wary of long engagements overseas. At the same time, military personnel increasingly came from diverse backgrounds, reflecting broader social changes. One less obvious but important feature of modern warfare has been the role of information and media. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for influence and propaganda. Both state and non-state actors harnessed these tools to shape narratives, recruit followers, and destabilize opponents. The line between truth and misinformation blurred, complicating traditional military objectives. In some cases, these information campaigns had real-world effects, sparking protests, violence, or shifts in political power. Cyber attacks on election infrastructure, misinformation about pandemics, and targeted social media ads became part of a new kind of conflict, one fought not with tanks or drones, but with data and deception. Historians and strategists debate the implications of these trends. Some argue that warfare is entering a new era, where direct combat is only one part of a broader competition for influence and control. Others worry that the increasing reliance on technology and remote operations could lead to miscalculation, accidental escalation, or loss of human judgment. Despite the complexity, one constant remains: war is a human endeavor, shaped by politics, culture, and the choices of individuals. Even as tools change, the underlying questions persist. When is it justified? How much power should a nation wield? What are the costs seen and unseen? The 21st century has proven that there is no simple answer. The United States, like all nations, continues to grapple with these questions as it navigates a world where threats are diffuse, alliances fragile, and peace uncertain. This ongoing evolution suggests that American military history is far from over. The wars fought in the past 2 decades are chapters in a much larger story, one that will continue to unfold in new and unexpected ways. As the 21st century continues to unfold, the story of American warfare is far from complete. Reflecting on every conflict the United States has been involved in, reveals a complex tapestry woven from ambition, ideology, security concerns, and sometimes miscalculations. From the Revolutionary War's fight for independence to the current shadow wars fought across deserts and cyberspace, the nation's military history is a testament to both its power and its challenges. One striking through line is the persistent tension between ideals and reality. The United States was founded on principles of liberty and self-determination. Yet many of its wars involved expansion, occupation, and sometimes actions that contradicted those very ideals. The fight against slavery in the Civil War was a pivotal moment in aligning war with principle. But other conflicts, like the Indian Wars or the Philippine-American War, reveal darker chapters of coercion and conquest. Technology has continually reshaped how America fights, from muskets and cannon to drones and cyber attacks. Each innovation promised more precision and less bloodshed, but often introduced new ethical dilemmas and unintended consequences. The rise of unmanned systems, for example, offers a kind of detachment from the battlefield that changes the nature of risk and responsibility. Another recurring theme is the difficulty of achieving clear, lasting victories. Many wars ended not with definitive triumphs, but with uneasy compromises, stalemates, or long-term instability. The Revolutionary War gave birth to a nation, but left questions of governance and identity unresolved. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan defeated regimes or groups, but struggled to create stable societies afterward. Public opinion and political will have been decisive forces. The Vietnam War's unpopularity reshaped how America approaches military engagement, just as the casualties and controversies of more recent conflicts continue to influence policy debates. The limits of military power and the costs of ignoring those limits have been learned repeatedly, often the hard way. Historians still argue over motives, outcomes, and lessons. Was the Mexican-American War an act of manifest destiny or imperial overreach? Could the Cold War have been won without proxy wars? Did the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan prevent terrorism or fuel it? These questions have no simple answers, reflecting the complexities of history and human nature. Throughout these chapters, the personal stories of soldiers, civilians, leaders, and victims form the heart of the narrative. The scars of war, physical, psychological, and societal, persist long after treaties are signed. From the battlefield amputees of the Civil War to the drone operators, hundreds of miles away, war touches countless lives in ways that statistics and strategies can never fully capture. As the country looks ahead, the future of warfare remains uncertain. Emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, space-based systems, and biotechnology may redefine conflict again. New challenges like climate change, cyber attacks, and global pandemics blur the lines between war and peace. But one certainty remains: war is never just about battles. It's about people, power, values, and choices. Every conflict the United States has entered is a reflection of who it was at the time and who it hoped to become. The story of America at war is a story of transformation, contradiction, and resilience. It is a story still being written. The quiet moments after war are often the hardest to understand. The thunder of battle fades, but the echoes linger in memories, landscapes, and lives forever changed. Each conflict leaves behind more than just history books. It leaves lessons and legacies, both visible and hidden. For those who fought and those who waited, for the families and communities torn apart, the meaning of war is deeply personal. It is pain and pride, loss and hope, horror and humanity entwined. In the stillness, it is important to remember that war is not inevitable. It is a choice, sometimes made in desperation, sometimes in pride, sometimes in fear. And those choices shape the future for generations to come. So as the story of America's wars comes to a close tonight, it is not an ending, but a reminder to listen, to learn, and to strive for a world where the next chapter is written, not in violence, but in peace. Thank you for journeying through this complex, difficult, and deeply human history. May it guide us toward wiser paths. End of script. Sweet dreams.